Should I stay or should I go? Today, we've got a question coming in from an employee at a Series B company. And just as context here, they reached out and they've got um, kind of a particular situation, but can imagine that there's other folks that might be in different versions of this. And today, we're going to go through their kind of key question and the decision that they're trying to make, give some context around it, and give it to the Herringbone Decision AI and see what it has to say about it, see what sort of perspective it takes, what sort of angles it looks at, the key questions it comes up for making this decision. And along the way as well, I'll give some of my takes, my impressions of it. We'll get through that decision to give the employee a pretty good sense of how to think about it and how to go about the situation that they're in. In the context here, they're basically saying, look, I don't like my boss, but I'm at a company that's doing well. Should I stay? Should I stick it out or leave? And it's additional context. It's a Series B startup. So I think the perception here is like the equity value might be there, might be growing. Company's on a good trajectory, but this person feels like they're stuck in a bad position where they're not getting what they're looking for from their boss here. So we'll walk through it. The first thing that we do is actually feed the information and context into the AI and look at some of the questions that pop out. So really the way to think about this is there's different questions that, depending on the answer to them, will actually sway the AI one way or another. So in this case, maybe towards staying or towards leaving, depending on the answer to these questions. So let's go through some of the questions that the AI comes up with and think through how they might affect the decision here. So the first question is the boss's problematic behavior isolated to you, or do you know of more team members experiencing some of the same sorts of issues? So I think what it's getting at here is like, are you the only one? Is there something special about you? And maybe you just there's a personality clash or otherwise, but other folks on the team actually are getting the right sort of mentorship and guidance and development opportunities that they're looking for from this boss, but it's just not working for you. Or is this something that kind of across the board on your team, everybody's talking, and it's kind of more problematic across the board. So, the AI here is basically saying, well, why does that matter? The distinction between these two really determines whether you're facing a personal conflict or there's something more systematic, a leadership problem, either with just this boss or perhaps management more generally at this company. And so, if the boss's behavior is just isolated towards you, it probably strengthens the case for staying and working on the relationship, or hoping that the boss moves on, or there's some changes there. But if not, and it's kind of more pervasive, well, it seems like that problem might be more structural and much less likely to improve. So I think that's kind of the first question that it came back with. And I think the why it matters is important. I would actually go one step further here with it, and this is just my take, but I think that if it was something that was more systemic, obviously there's a lot of issues that can come up at Series B startups. I think startups in general, when they're successful, it can often be despite a lot of issues at the company, not necessarily because of great management. And so, that's maybe just something to consider here is like, is this something that might actually be an impediment, to the growth of the company and the ultimate equity value that you would hope to see, or not? Is this kind of more isolated and, there's great leadership in other groups, let's say, with it, but, really be critical in thinking about that one, because like I said, there's plenty of startups that have unlocked a huge amount of equity value, even with, mediocre or subpar management, or quite a few problems at the company there, and are successful, again, despite that, and and certainly not necessarily because of it, but despite it. And so that's important to kind of consider here as well. Okay, second question from the AI. Will your equity vest to a life-changing an amount? It says over $1 million after taxes is the amount that it puts forward with that within the next 18 months based off of where you think the current company trajectory is. Okay, well, why does this matter? It's saying that, this threshold represents the point where, the financial gains might be really transformative. Obviously, if you think that the equity vesting might be over and above that sort of amount, it does strengthen the case for just staying. It says unless health is severely compromised, if no, shifts towards leaving, as the upside doesn't really justify having some sort of a toxic relationship. So, okay, so what's the upside? You're looking at this both from the perspective of are you going to be able to stay to realize and invest that equity? And then, what is a realistic, visibility that this employee has on the value of their equity? This one's a little bit harder on, from my perspective. Here, giving my take, oftentimes at these types of organizations, depending on when this person joined, if it was shortly after the Series B or otherwise, they might not have a good enough perspective to really understand kind of what the trajectory of the company truly is, what its prospects are for next round of funding, what the likely valuations would be, what the perception in the market is for it. And given, I think that, the question underlying here of maybe not a great relationship with a boss, it makes me think that this is obviously somebody who's not at the C-level or executive level. So again, they might have, considerably less visibility into that. And so, any of the positive perceptions I would think that this person has, maybe from working internally, I would probably just caution to, make sure that that's actually jiving with some of the external signals that are there, and don't just kind of rely on past fundraising success. Think critically about kind of what milestones would really need to be in place for the business to raise a Series C, and, is there clear progress towards that? So I think that's an important aspect here, is just kind of how do you really value the equity in the business. Obviously, I don't think this is something where you just take, the company's perspective on it. And so, want to think critically about that. Okay, third question is, has your boss actively blocked or undermined your career advancement opportunities in the past 6 months? Okay, well, this this would really kind of gets right at the core of, is this something that's a personality thing, or, is there kind of a substantial impediment? The AI is saying this matters because it really just tells you, is the boss being difficult, or is it actively kind of damaging some of your career capital? If it's a yes, would obviously shift towards wanting to leave immediately to kind of prevent further damage, or just, move out of that situation as soon as you had something else lined up. If no, would probably strengthen the argument for staying, as long as your kind of core career growth remains intact. It might also, my take on that part is just that it might also give you, if you feel like you haven't been impeded, but maybe there's a personality conflict or otherwise with it, you might, if you're still getting kind of the career growth, it might open up opportunities for transferring within the company, or taking on other roles, or working with other folks, and maybe establishing kind of different dotted line relationships or otherwise to kind of get you into a different position with that. So I think the extent to which you're really trapped and being impeded here is probably pretty significant. Okay, well, let's dive into some of the key decision factors that the AI surfaced from that. And remember, for this AI, it's, again, these large language models in general, and I know that the Herringbone AI is an ensemble model, so it actually puts together, different large language models from kind of across 100 different models for it. But in general, a lot of these models are trained on internet commentary, let's say. So, these sorts of situations where they've come up, advice has been given, et cetera, that all is kind of creates some sort of an imprint that that the AI works off of. And interesting to see how some of this stuff comes together when it comes up with different kind of key decision factors, what it thinks are really the significant pieces that could move you one way or another in this decision. So the things that it considered here, one is the power law dynamics of startup equity. And the fact that that really creates like a what it calls an asymmetric risk profile. So the idea being that there are certain startups that will create disproportionate amounts of value, and if you happen to be in one of those with startup equity, that will obviously be life changing for you. And so, being in the right startup, given power law dynamics, some folks kind of at one side of the curve will perform so much better than others that are coming in at the other end. That really which startup you're in could be hugely formative, regardless of kind of how well you progress at that company. I guess let's say lower performers at Google in very early days did much better financially than high performers at other startups at that same time. So that I think is obviously a key decision factor here. The other aspect that it brings up, is what it calls degradation risk, and that kind of suggests that what it calls passive endurance might not be viable. So I think the idea here being that that these types of situations can wear you down essentially. And so while it might sound like, hey, just give it another year and, wait till you vest a little bit more, et cetera, the human reality of like dealing with that on a day-to-day basis, like sometimes just isn't quite as practical as it maybe theoretically seems. So interesting to see it pulled that up. And then it also talks about kind of what it calls a adaptation paradox, which, really just like highlights the need for personal growth, how people kind of adapt, change, have a growth mindset. And I think particularly for a lot of startup employees, this is an important part. It's why they would seek out that type of work, look for environments that aren't highly structured, but have the ability to create a lot of growth. And it really says the adaptation paradox, I think, talks about how, that growth potential is really important for people beyond kind of just like mere survival with it. So that's a little bit of the background from AI, what they're actually seeing, how it's actually thinking about it, or looking for patterns here. And, next I'll give you some of my thoughts on it and my take, and then we'll get into kind of the bottom line from the AI, what it thinks you should do here, and I'll wrap up with some of my last thoughts here as well. So I want to dive in a little bit here more on the adaptation paradox, because it actually really seems in this that the AI is picking up on that as a key consideration. And I don't know that that's really the first thing that would come to mind to most humans really analyzing this decision, but it really comes up quite a bit here in the analysis. And I want to go a little bit deeper here. So really kind of thinking about this as like a organizational or psychological adaptability. Just looking this up, it really refers to situations where you really need to and urgently kind of need to change or adapt. And those sorts of conditions that really demand adaptation actually make it the most difficult to achieve. So let's just unpack that for a bit. I guess if you're in a very high stress environment that you need to adapt, you need to change to be able to be successful there, that actually the fact that you need to change or need to adapt quite a bit actually makes it harder for you to do that, or works against you in some ways to be able to achieve that. So it looks like this is a phenomenon that's been studied for quite some time, looking at people under high stress or high uncertainty situations. And they tend to, I guess a lot of researchers have actually found that individuals and organizations as a whole tend to kind of default to more familiar behavior or established practices, even when they're not really all that effective. And so the people that really most need to change actually have the highest tendency to resist and maybe default to kind of old habits here as well. So what does that mean kind of in the context of an employee at a Series B startup that, it's not working well and not jiving with your boss? It might cast some doubt on being able to really make changes here that are going to going to make that a good situation for them. I think just being self-aware on how much you might be part of the issue with your boss and otherwise, or what's really required to change there, makes it kind of a murkier situation. And startups are, high pressure, tend to be stressful environments as well if you're not used to kind of that pace and that change. And so it makes it less likely that both the employee or their boss would make kind of the adaptations that were necessary to make that a good relationship. So I think that's interesting that it's really calling that out as a key factor here, because it does kind of maybe challenge the conventional assumption that I would see, which is that hard times create opportunities, or hard times, going through hard times like this might create growth or personal growth, when in reality, this might not actually be the best type of environment for growth for this person. The employee had a chance to kind of make it work with their boss. It's not really working. Okay, how do they deal with that? That might not be the easiest thing for them to resolve. So anyway, that's a little bit of more detail on it that I think is particularly interesting, and maybe just a different frame of looking at this that might not really be natural to, didn't come to my mind at least, and I think for most people wouldn't be the first thing that they would think of in regards to this question and this key decision. Okay, well, let's move to the bottom line. What does the AI really think here? What should the employee do? So it actually proposes a 6-month kind of quote unquote trial period that it wants to have as more structured, with things that are kind of active intervention strategies and clear measurement systems. It says this approach would maximize the probability of capturing the significant upside while protecting against some of the downside risks. Overall, the exceptional potential of Series B equity in a thriving company justifies significant effort to make the situation work. So some of these next steps that it proposes are, quantify some of the stakes by really thinking hard about equity value and growth opportunities, try to diagnose the relationship to come up with some remediation strategies for it, establish some boundaries to minimize friction points, and create some measurement systems to help guide the decision-making process with it. So I'd interpret some of that as, don't be rash and make a snap judgment here. Try to, be conscious of this and kind of play this out over the next 6 months, and make sure that you don't, jump off of earlier Google, where you might really see that as a cause for, to resent that. If the company really is thriving, that that can create a lot of opportunities and might open up new opportunities for you. So try that out, but also don't just bury your head in the sand. I think what it's advocating for is try to be proactive about this, try to really measure what's going on, and then also be really hyper mindful of the value of the equity itself, because if the market turned against that startup, or it's no longer a attractive Series B and there's a bridge round or other aspects of it, that obviously will considerably change some of the calculation for it. So yeah, I think I'll give some perspective on this as well. I think that one of the things here that's kind of unsaid in the analysis or otherwise is just what really are the other opportunity sets or opportunities that are available to this employee. I think one thing that would be unsaid is the idea of just leaving with nothing else lined up. That doesn't really get you anywhere. You're probably better just vesting, continuing to vest at the startup while you try to make it work, perhaps while looking elsewhere, for another great opportunity. So I think just some of those sorts of considerations. I think the AI glosses over to some degree, or maybe just assumes that would be what someone is doing in those circumstances. But I think overall, the idea of not if there's really deep conviction that this is a great startup, looking for ways to navigate within it rather than pulling the ripcord, I think makes a lot of sense if there's a lot of conviction in the company. And I think that also just feeds into where there's opportunity. So really, if it is a strong growth story, that will create other opportunities within the business. And so if this is a situation where, love the business, excited about the management team, don't like my boss, well, okay, that last one probably can be fixed. Just if the company keeps growing, there might be opportunities to kind of transfer, get onto other teams, work with other people cross-functionally, or what have you, that can kind of reduce your reliance on this one individual with it. And I think that argues a lot for the course of action that the Herringbone Decision AI is advocating for here. Well, great. I think this is an interesting type of problem that comes up, weighs your kind of personal development and personal goals with some of the financial aspect of it. I think the other piece that really is important is to kind of have more of an investor mindset. If you find yourself in a situation like this where it's harder to justify just loving coming into work every day with it, and it's more of starts to become more of a financial calculation on the value of the equity. Just having more of that investor mindset of what are the prospects for the company, how are other outside investors that might actually have more access to information than you do as an employee. How are they valuing and positioning against the company? How much transparency is there from leadership? I think crucially, has that changed over time? Did you used to get more information around the Series A, and that's dried up now that you're kind of past the Series B? What's the cadence of board meetings like? Does the company shift around that? Is there information shared after the board meetings, and what tone? Is it complete? How do you really parse all of that sort of stuff? I think those are all the aspects that would potentially give you more clarity into the equity value. And that if you don't really have, you are making more of a blind bet, which in some circumstances could still really be the right move. But I think just being mindful of that, and not deluding yourself into kind of thinking that you know more if you don't, I think is also pretty prudent here. So overall, I think there's a way to mull this sort of decision over at length and ad nauseum, but kind of committing to some degree to keep revisiting this every couple months, look for kind of opportunities as they develop at the company, being laser focused on kind of the value that really is being created there, and the prospects for the company is also important. And then, of course, continuing to perhaps be actively networking or otherwise, to make sure you have a finger on a pulse of other opportunities. Sound typically a smart thing to do if things aren't going well with your boss, and that's kind of a more difficult relationship. So that's something to consider. I think the other aspect that you'll sometimes see is if things turn at a company, and I think as we've kind of gone through the 2022, 2023 period, let's say, and kind of coming out the other side of that, where it seemed like everybody was doing layoffs, even companies that quote unquote were hot or had been growing very extensively. And, typically if your relationship with your boss isn't very good, then the likelihood of surviving layoffs is probably also not very high. frankly. And, so just kind of keeping these sorts of things in mind of if there are other opportunities that surface that you feel like are equivalent, you feel like you've vested to some degree at the Series B company, maybe it's time to kind of diversify and spread your bets. Obviously, that doesn't apply if you're, still under a year of service, let's say, at the company. Then you don't have that sort of flexibility. So that might have been another question that I would have added in, is just kind of like, what is the, what exactly is your kind of equity situation in terms of your cliff, how much you've vested, what sort of milestones are there, has, what kind of evergreen grants have been given, what does that look like, to really just understand maybe there is more of an optimal point where it makes sense to stay, but try to line up other things. And, if your relationship with your boss hasn't improved by then you kind of give yourself a kind of firm cutoff date and deadline for that. So lots of stuff to think about here, things that are typically on the mind of a lot of folks, maybe to varying degrees of either. I could see same question being on the other side, loving your boss, feeling like that's a great relationship, but the company's not doing as well. Do you stick around? Maybe that'll be something we tackle in another episode here. Great. This is an interesting one, and would love to dive in and revisit this and perhaps talk to the employee somewhere down the line. Have a great one.